Hello back. That brings us now to the chapter of locomotion. Well, it's actually a chapter on joints, really, at the end of the day. But locomotion is what describes the act of self-propulsion. And when we look at all the things that come up now, we're going to look at the extremity bones, and then we're going to look at the extremity muscles thereafter. And those are really involved in what we describe as locomotion, that act of self-propulsion by an animal. Well, we are an animal. That locomotive system includes moving body parts, but it also includes holding of body parts in defined positions, like in a posture, to then be able to move the parts. You see that when you work out, if you work out, or when you sit or do something for a long time, as your posture decreases, your efficiency of the system it decreases, but also your injury propensity goes up, and so you might get hurt easier. And so one of the things that I always try to tell my patients is be very careful of how you posture is when you work out. Have good form. That is very important. The locomotion system has two parts. It has a passive system, that's the bones and the joints, and that's what we talk now about. And then it also has the active part of the system, and that is the skeletal muscles as well as the tendons. And the tendons are the parts that attach the muscle to the bone. So they're sort of the white things at the end of the muscle that put it to the bone. We also have ligaments, and ligaments are attachment bands that hold bones together. So when we talk ligaments and tendons, we also often use them together. But the ligaments are bone-to-bone connections, and the tendons are muscle-to-bone connections. Connections between bones are joints. The term arth is a prefix that tells us we're having to deal with joints. So whenever you see something arthritis or so, it's called a joint something. And itis is an inflammation, so arthritis is an inflammation of a joint, basically. Why is that the case? Well, we don't know. We have different types of arthritis. So that will then describe the type of arthritis. So we have these joints, they are the ones that enable movement of the skeletal system, and they also of us, and they also transmit forces. They are the most vulnerable part of the skeletal system. And when we look at them, and we can categorize them between different parts, different measures, we can have them categorized by how much do they move, because the joints that you and I think of joints are actually just part of the joints, because those are just the movable joints down here. Some of the joints don't move, they're immobile, and some slightly move. Now what I'll tell you is the description of how it is in the textbook, but I'll also talk a little bit more about it, because some of the things are not all that uniform the way they are described. We can also categorize the joints by the type of connections. And so what we're going to do next, we're going to look at these movable or immovable joints, and we'll look at the different types that make those joints happen that way. See, we have joints in the disc between vertebrae, we have joints in the teeth. That's a joint too. And then we have elbow and knee kind of type joints, the regulars. So when we look at joints, we first have the immovable joints. And one of the things in these chapters that must drive you nuts is there's a lot of terms. So be gentle with yourself about those terms. I'll try to make sense of them. So a syn, arthroses are immovable joints. Syn, S-Y-N, means together. And so those joints are separated by different tissues. And when we say immovable, some of that stuff I kind of have a little argument with. And so let's go through them. We have some joints that are connected by fibers. They're fibrous joints. These are called syndesmoses. Syn again means together. Desmosis just means fibers. They're tough connective tissue fibers and interosseous membranes that hold, for example, the forearm muscles, bones together, the ulna and the radius. Or that's a very tight band in between here, the foramen, between the radius and the ulna. Or those are sutures between the skulls. We described those in the skull chapter briefly. Or then we also have the teeth. The gomphoses are teeth joints. And those are also fibrous, very strong connection joints. They hardly move at all. They better don't move much. And then we got cartilaginous joints, and those also sort of don't move but a little bit. Those are synchondroses. Chondro is everything cartilage. So, for example, the fibrocartilage in between the bones of the vertebra, the intervertebral discs, they are that kind of joint. Or the bones in the front of the hip where they come together, the pubic bone, that is also having a disc in there. That's a joint as well. Also, when we look at the ribs that are connected to the sternum, the breastbone in the front, there's also a lot of cartilage there. So that's hyaline cartilage, that's not fibrocartilage, that's a little different. But those are also joints. They're called the costochondral joints. Costosternal joints, sorry. And then we also have these type of joints, technically speaking, in the long bones as long as they grow, between the midsection, the shaft, the diaphysis, and the end, the epiphysis, this epiphyseal plate. We have that too. And then we also have joints that are formed because they were actually different bones that grew together, like the sacrum or the pelvis, the hip. And so those are synostoses. Osto means bone. So those are also kind of interesting. And then we have slightly movable joints. They move a little bit more. Those are amphiarthroses. Amphi means they move a little bit. And they have limited mobility because of the joint surfaces and strong ligaments. For example, we have joint between the lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. The main lower leg bone and the outside one. Those are slightly movable. They have very strong ligaments in between them. Then we also have sacroiliac joints. Those are between the sacrum and the hip bone. They're also a little bit moving, but not much. So you see some of them here. You see some fibrous joint here. You see the sutural connections. That's a fibrous joint, a syndesmosis. Over here we have an example of a symphysis. We have the intervertebral disc. We also have the pubic symphysis here in the front. It's not indicated though. And then, oh, here it is. See, look at that. And then we have some cartilaginous joints here. For example, as we look here, this is a weird one, but that's the first rib hyaline cartilage right here. The whole connection between the ribs and the breastbone are ribs, or connections are cartilage. And then the main joints that we call joints are really these freely movable joints. Technically, we can call them diarthroses. So let's look at those, and we look at those and see, have a look at some of their features, what they consist of. So these movable joints, freely movable joints, they're also known as synovial joints because basically when you look at them, you got the two ends of bones that come together. So what we need to have is at the ends of bones we need to have cartilage because we don't want the bones to rub against bones. So we have cartilage that can rub against each other. So let's consider that's a knee bone or something, a knee joint. And then we need to keep all that here together. So we have these strong ligaments that go from bone to bone that keep it together. The joint capsule, we can call that. And then in the inside we'll have a fluid. So part of the joint capsule will have to secrete a fluid and part will make it very, very strong. So let's look at the description of these terms here. So we have the joint cartilage at the end of the bones. That's a hyaline cartilage. Its extracellular matrix consists of collagen fibers and water-trapping sugary proteins, which is great as a shock absorber. And I just found a typo. This structure needs to be looked at a little bit more in detail because this structure is avascular. So it's a great shock absorber because we got this water trapped in there, but it doesn't have blood supply, which makes sense because if it would, you will bleed all the time whenever it contracts. I mean, whenever it gets squeezed together. And so the nutrients, though, because it's avascular, the nutrients must be passing through the synovial fluid Well, the synovial fluid actually is secreted from the blood, so that has nutrients. But that synovial fluid, that fluid around that cartilage that's trapped inside that joint, needs to be squeezed in and out of that cartilage like a sponge. And so that requires loading and unloading. So over here, you see these arrows? That's the loading and unloading. If we don't have that loading and unloading, we will have a lack of movement, and that will create degeneration. That's osteoarthritis. So simply the non-movement in gravity will cause osteoarthritis over time. So that's a problem, because if you just do couch potato life, then that's not helpful, because it does degeneration, even though you think you don't do anything. So we have to be careful about that. And then the regenerative power of this cartilage is quite insignificant, because it does not have a periosteum, so it does not have a skin around it that helps it regenerate. Okay, so that's the end of bones. And then surrounding this whole construction with the bones coming together is this joint capsule right here. And this joint capsule is a continuation of the periosteum. It has an outer dense fibrous membrane that protects the joint at the end range of motion. And immobilization of that causes a capsule to shrink and so that's something that's interesting when we look at non-movement. So when we have a problem, we break something, we don't move a shoulder joint over time, that capsule becomes tighter, and we have to go through physical therapy to move it around again. This capsule is reinforced by different ligaments. Ligaments, again, are bone-to-bone connections. And then we have an inner synovial membrane. That's the inner membrane right here on the inside, and that membrane secretes and reabsorbs synovial fluid, which is a thick and viscous type fluid that nourishes then and lubricates the joint surfaces, the cartilage of that. Well, that's interesting. There you go. That's pretty much about how those things look, these structures.